This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. My name is Mary Fitzgerald. I'm a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's IIEA webinar, Future Africa-Europe, Time for a Paradigm Shift. This is the third and final webinar as part of the IIEA's 2024 EU-Africa program. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Holy Ranaivozanany, who is Deputy Executive Director of the Africa-Europe Foundation. Just a few housekeeping notes. We will begin today with a keynote address by Holly, which will take about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will go to a Q&A with you, our audience. You will be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to send your questions in throughout the session as they occur to you, and we will come to them once Holly has finished her presentation. I would ask you to keep your questions as succinct as possible, given our limited time. And a quick reminder before I hand over to Holly, that today's presentation and Q&A are both on the record. So then to introduce Holly. Holly is Deputy Executive Director, as I said, of the Africa-Europe Foundation, overseeing strategy, partnerships, and outreach across Africa, Europe, and multilateral platforms. Previously, she led corporate social responsibility and sustainability for Fortune 500 companies in China and France, championing digital inclusion and climate solutions. She has collaborated with UN organizations and think tanks to shape global policy and technology for good, and has contributed to thought leadership in sustainability, disaster relief, and circular economy innovation. Holly, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mary, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for having me for this conversation to really discuss a little bit the Africa-Europe partnership. Maybe before I deep dive into, let's say, the key topic of today's conversation, I'd like maybe to give a very short introduction to the Africa-Europe Foundation, as I'm not sure that all of you have been familiar, exposed to our work and what we have been doing. So the foundation itself is quite new, 4 years old, really, that have been created by 4 organizations, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, Friends of Europe, the African Climate Foundation, and the One Campaign. So it has been set up really to kind of look at this Africa-Europe partnership in a different angle. It's really about also understanding that there is a gap in terms of the engagement between the two continents, and there's a need for a platform that kind of connect better at institutions level, at member states level, at different, let's say, platforms level as well, this kind of partnership, and also to engage better on different areas, common priorities between the two continents. So when we were set up 4 years ago, it was very much trying to understand how to connect greater the two continents. And that comes first from what we call dialogue platforms. So that is about identifying these priority areas where we see greater value of engaging together. That comes from energy, agri-food systems, climate, looking at digital transformation, infrastructure, and also anchored, of course, by our work around youth. Youth representing 60% of the African population today, having less than 25 years old, a very important component of the way we've been working and making sure that they're also part in the decision-making processes. So these dialogue platforms, it's also about 180 leaders within 50 countries that are really contributing to advancing this conversation. And that's really about making sure we have inclusive platforms, cross-cutting across sectors as well, breaking silos. When we talk about climate, we talk as well about health, we talk about as well digital, we about youth, etc. But the idea is really to have that diverse leadership across Africa and Europe, and of course, diverse opinion as well. So it is as inclusive as possible when we talk about this partnership. And it's about as well having a safe space to have this kind of quality conversation to really address this partnership in a more frank and also direct manner that goes beyond, let's say, institutions level, member states levels, and so on, where we already have these established dialogue platforms. Among, just maybe to mention among our members, for instance, important to note that we have President Mary Robinson, who's one of our honorary presidents, alongside President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So that's the first point of our work. The second one is really about looking at research and knowledge products. And what we mean by that is quite clear. The partnership, the Africa Partnership, has for a very long time been an emotionally loaded partnership. We need to acknowledge that there's been history across both continents, of course, history of colonialization for many years. But now we need to also look at how do we make sure that the decisions that we take on this partnership should be as well scientific based, based on specific evidence. So this is important for us to kind of work with different think tanks as well in academia, so that whatever we do, whatever decisions or policy recommendations we're doing on this partnership, it's also very much linked as well with evidence-based approach. And this is why, particularly this year, we launched what we called an independent research consortium, specifically on Africa and Europe, that actually would help us deep dive in terms of specific issues in which we will be working on. And that cover wide range of areas, looking at, for instance, green industrialization, looking at export financing, looking at energy and climate. So for us to come and bring on the table strong proposals, strong policy recommendations that also been vetted with different and renowned academia and researchers. And this is a very important evolution, I would say, on this kind of approach. Because what we say, it's not just about the dialogue platforms, but how to actually turn that as well into action, specific recommendations, working with specific countries, so really driving the whole process. But that is also to make sure that in addition to all the different research products that we've been doing, it's also to catalyze not only the advocacy, but also the operationalization of this partnership. Just to name a few, for instance, we know that the conversation around carbon markets, CBAMs are, of course, very sensitive on top of the agenda when we talk about Africa-Europe partnership, when we talk about financing, when we talk about energy, when we talk about carbon pricing. And this is, for instance, something we've been looking into together with partners like IC4All or Sciences Po Paris, to say, well, there is probably need to a greater understanding between the continents on these issues. We need to look at capacity building across both continents. So even if we don't agree or we don't have the same understanding, at least there is a conversation ongoing and we understand each other's approach. And that's the carbon markets training that we have been piloting for now and see how we can scale up that kind of initiative. But then I'll take as well the examples when we say bridging really the silos, when we talk about climate health financing. Today, we know that there is a lot of conversation around climate diplomacy, lots of conversation following COP29, 300 billion. Is that enough? It's not enough. Obviously, how to look at how to finance basically that climate transition. When we look in particular on the climate health conversation, we know that in terms of 5% of climate adaptation, finance only goes to adaptation solutions. And that's one of the biggest areas where we need to invest more. So clearly here, through our report that we've been doing, is try to catalyze more funding, bring in, of course, philanthropies and private sector to kind of fund specifically in climate health adaptation. So very dedicated calls where we know that there is an opportunity from there. And last example, just to talk about this impactful research that we're trying to push a little bit further, is around issues that have never been really on top of the agenda of policymakers. And yet we know there should be also being looked into. And here I'm taking the example in particular of blue economy, ocean governance. We know countries like Kenya or small islands like Seychelles or Madagascar, or looking at well from Europe, countries like Portugal, have been investing a lot in terms of capacity, in terms of research, in terms of exchanges around ocean governance and blue economy. And that is very much about to unlock that potential. So for us, coming into issues where we cannot see it's an untapped opportunity, it's been almost forgotten, not seen properly. It's also about trying to elevate the conversation around these specific issues. So that's the second part of the work of the foundation. Again, always in partnership, in collaboration with all the different partners, from policymakers to think tank and academia. And the last one, which is around looking at the AU-EU summit. What is important since the year 2000, at institutions level, the African Union and the European Union have held some summits every 4 years to kind of looking at the state of the relationship. So first, recognizing there is a partnership that needs to be nurtured, of course, that we need to build with. And there are some commitments from both institutions, of course, powered and anchored and supported by member states, by the head of states of the different member states, to kind of agree, here are the issues that we need to work on, from health. And here, the latest one was in February 2022. We just came out of the pandemic. So, of course, number one priority was very much around health issues. And here we're talking about vaccination, vaccine manufacturing, particularly on the African continent. So, again, in that spirit of really emphasizing supporting local manufacturing. So, that was, for instance, one of what we say, one of the palpable examples that we've seen within the partnership that has worked quite well. But it's also about issues from education, skills, job creation, to as well, of course, commitment to multilateralism, peace and security, and so on. So 12 big commitments that have been agreed at a head of state level, and that needs to be kind of looked into, monitored in a sense. So of course, there are like official monitoring mechanism at the institutions level, but the way that we work at the Africa Arab Foundation is to act as that independent monitoring platform in the spirit, not really to do a blame and shame exercise. I think for us is trying to understand where this partnership has been, where we're heading, what are the issues that have been lagged behind, and for us, of course, with the different partners, to ensure that we elevate the conversation at the right level and making sure that there is, of course, a progress within this partnership. One of the things, of course, we have looked into very clearly is the Global Gateway Africa-Europe package, which is 150 billion euros, by 2027, really to address various issues, trying to align with, of course, the AU Vision 2063, the aspirations for development, but of course aligned as well with the UN SDGs or the Agenda 2030, and of course Africa's Europe strategy as well towards Africa. So from infrastructure to education to health, etc. So what we've been doing is, and I recommend everyone, I'm happy to share the link later on, is a report that we released in February 2024 that share a first state of play of where we are actually on this, not only just the investment package, but also looking at the progress as well in terms of this partnership. There are a couple, and one that we also can maybe mention is, for instance, the participation of the African Union to the G20 processes, so G20 plus one. So that one of the example, for instance, that Europe in particular with other partners have been pushing through. So a great example was, I mentioned before, all this conversation around the vaccine manufacturing, which we have already in 8 countries. So a good example. Having said that, of course, there are a couple of issues I wanted to highlight from our work where we see a little bit of challenges, the challenges that, of course, we need to address a little bit better. First one, I think there is a bit of a lack of understanding of what happened, in terms of the flagship program or the source of funding, or lack of understanding how this Global Gateway investment package work. And I want to take a little bit of time here because this is quite important. February 2022, as we all know, it's quite an important moment. Of course, that was the 6th AU-EU summit between Africa and Europe, a summit that has been already postponed. So there was a little bit of expectations that this would happen, lots of optimism. So we came at that meeting full of hope. We agreed on specific issues. Investment package was announced a couple of weeks before that. So we know we were going on the right direction. But February 2022 was also the start of the war in Ukraine. So that means as well, over the past couple of weeks and months following the summit of the Africa-Europe, there was a really diminishing trust that has been growing since, unfortunately, between Africa and Europe. And that was literally because there was a perception of a diversion of the funds that were supposed to be for the partnership and redirected to Ukraine. I'm saying it's a perception. But that was very strong and didn't really help, of course, in terms of the relationship, and things have been delayed as well in the implementation of that global gateway. So especially when the spirit was this is a co-investment program, it's also an investment package. So we're also changing here the narrative. That was the spirit, how it's been created from really the old, let's say, a narrative donor recipient or aid type of approach to really that investment. But unfortunately, I think until now there's still that limited visibility. How do we get access to this funding? To what? Is it new money, more money, etc.? So I think there's still a little bit of work that needs to happen particularly from Europe on that, to clarify, of course, the objectives, and to show as well where we're going towards that. The second point, it's quite linked with the first one, is really kind of an insufficient communication alignment with from the African Union and also the European side. And here it's quite clear. When we talk about an investment package, there is also an expectation of waiting some bankable projects. You need to scale some of the initiative if you want to make an impact. And unfortunately, I think from the African side, maybe we don't have enough of these bankable projects. It means you cannot tap into the investment package that's been announced. Let's just take an example of education. Education skills, that's 40% of the investment package. So 40% at 150 billion. That's quite, I would say, a lot of money that needs to be poured into education. Right now, when we talk about programs around Team Europe initiative around education and skills and job creation, youth, etc. We're looking at 10 million, 15 million program here and there. So we are quite far from this 40% that have been discussed and agreed. And that is, again, very much linked with that lack of projects that we could invest into. So even if the, let's say, the objectives or the ambition is really from a startup to scale up, I think there's still quite a long way to get there. So probably I would not see it only at the challenge side, but very much the opportunity to say, well, listen, there's maybe something that we could do more to kind of accelerate that engagement together, so that we can work and find in these programs that make an impactful one, a regional level, or also could be at a local level between the two continents, but at least something concrete that can show as well results. And the final point that we've seen in particular in terms of the financial commitments here as well is actually some of the challenges to leverage private sector investment. So Global Gateway, of course, it's one thing. It's, as I mentioned, 150 billion, but we know as well the needs of the continents and the opportunities that could arise through that. It's pretty big. If I just take the example of infrastructure in Africa in particular, infrastructure gap today, it's between 68 billion to 108 billion annually. That's only for infrastructure. So if we have to advance around roads, around trying to connect all the different lobitos, the corridors, the strategic corridors, there are 12 of them, for instance, it's in Africa. If we want to enhance as well that African competitiveness, that needs to start first with infrastructure. And that's quite a massive investment. And again, I think one of the issues that we've seen, it's rated to these bankable projects, or even the approach to take at a regional level. I think the ecosystem may not be mature enough to do that. We also see over issues, of course, this lack of financing of bringing in the private sector. Of course, there are instruments like a Team Europe that encourage them to already there, but it's not for everyone. So what we're trying to see as well is not only we're trying to bring in maybe some investment, but how do we ensure that local SMEs, for instance, in Africa, can also benefit from this investment. And it's not just the big European companies that actually get as well the markets on the ground. So it's probably a greater partnership that we need to encourage between these big companies, small SMEs, getting them in full capacity to make sure we effectively leverage really this investment, and also it's there for more a sustainable and longer sustainable approach. So couple of things that probably needs to be thought through a little bit in terms of how do we have that greater alignment when we talk about, of course, these investments, these different commitments within the Africa-Europe partnership. And one thing I want to mention on that is a work that we've been doing right now with AUDA-NEPAD, which is an agency from the African Union, to actually look at that greater alignment between the Global Gateway Investment Package and, in particular, the infrastructure projects that we have been having in Africa, and really looking at if today we've seen that most African governments are actually leading this investment in infrastructure, what we need to see is bring more together this private sector. So that's one of the key findings that we see, so that, again, we can find more of these bankable projects, and of course, trying to make sure that we can also, let's say, empower this kind of local capacity, these small enterprises, to make sure that they also can benefit for the whole partnership. That report is not yet out yet. We're just at the preliminary kind of findings, but we'll definitely trying to release that at the next Financing Common Summit in Cape Town, really looking at this unlocking, how do we unlock really that sustainable infrastructure financing. So again, finding ways with what we have already to ensure that we make the best basically of what we have. The second thing is, of course, within as well this partnership beyond, I would say, the financing conversation, because we know that that's important, but it's not the whole story. Is back to what I mentioned at the beginning, is really about that changing the narrative. The first one, what we need to do is, we are in a partnership conversation. We need to look at it from a partnership of equals, and what it means as well is we are at the same level at the different partners, and that's why the investment conversation is quite important. So really moving from the donor aid recipient to what Africa can bring to Europe and vice versa. So really trying to leverage each other expertise, exchange. We need also to build on that trust, mutual trust that, as I mentioned, have been really declining for the past years now, that we need to build back, and making sure as well, I think, in terms of the added value of the partnerships that needs to happen, because I think the dynamics have also changed. There are different players that also on the continent. So with Europe, there's been a long-term history, obviously, when we need to bring it to the next level to really make sure that it's fully a mutually beneficial partnership. The second one is back to what I mentioned before, is that private sector investment, the business community, that also to bring in terms of the financing gap that we have. I took the example of infrastructure, but just if we look at figures in particular, looking at 2021, 68% of what Europe sold to Africa were actually manufactured goods, and 48% of what Africa sold to Europe were raw materials and energy. So how do we make sure that there is a greater balance as well in kind of really investing in local added value manufacturing as well on the continent? So it's not just pure raw materials. We create a little bit of a value out of that, creating jobs, obviously creating all ecosystems that should help and facilitate that ecosystem. And that's very much, for instance, the example of the conversation that we may have around critical raw materials. So greater added value that should be done first in Africa. That's something that we need to work further, not just with, of course, policymakers, have a frameworks, regulatory frameworks that need to put in place, but as well encouraging that investment with the business community. And of course, that needs to come as well with the notion of perception of risks. I mentioned about the bankable projects, but we need also, when we look at this co-investment approach, we need to make sure that there is a lower perception of risk. And we had the business community that's been engaged for a long time as well in Africa, and attracting them and serve as real champions. And the third point is really about this streamline of project preparations, very much back to, the bankable projects. If we need to make an impact, we need to have something tangible, big, that could be expanded, scaled up. I think that's quite important when we talk about a continental approach across both continents. But that is also about making sure that whatever we do is, of course, aligned with the economic or the social or the environmental impacts and expectations, and also looking at the development goals. And I think that alignment that had started, of course, to happen between Vision 2063 keep on being really being focused on. And the final point, because that partnership is obviously very large. We could talk about everything, but we also need to prioritize and see how do we address things on a more systematic way. Where do we need to find, of course, more partners, and where do we see as well greater opportunities for not just the alignment, but the real progress. So I mentioned a lot about the financing, the funding, etc., and the co-investment, but there's also another angle that we need to look into, which is about the African assets in particular. So I noted to that when we talk about the carbon markets, but there are other, let's say, avenues that could be explored as well when we talk about funding, which is, for instance, illicit financial flows. I mean, that's been on the table for many years, the conversation on global taxation, of course. And 2025 in particular would be a very good moment to kind of reflect on this, but also be a little bit more proactive. In particular, there's going to be the Financing for Dev conference that's going to be in Sevilla end of June, and that will be an important milestone as well, in particular for Africa, to kind of put on the table its assets. How do we also leverage greater as well these issues that would provide additional sources of funding, of course, and that is also an important moment because aligned with the presidency of South Africa in 2025. Of course, there are other issues that could continue to be explored, from the climate, health, finance on adaptation, the critical energy transition, looking at critical raw materials in particular and the role, or as I mentioned, all these untapped opportunities that we discussed before from the ocean partnership, for instance. So I think what I just wanted to say, this is a partnership that we have a lot of hope in, and we've seen that there is an appetite for greater, let's say, collaboration. However, with this trust deficit that has been growing as well across both continents, change of geopolitics, change of priorities, I think, and it's not just from Africa and Europe, that's something to take in mind, and the growing competition with the other partners and could even be competing, I would say, priorities have made it a little bit complicated. 2025 could be maybe the next AU-EU summit. We don't know yet. We've seen as well a change of a political cycle here in Europe, change of political leadership as well in Africa for the African Union in February 2025. We've seen changes, of course, in the US happening. Lots of 1/3 of the African population have gone into votes, into polls. And recently, we just had Namibia and Ghana that went through a transition. So I think this is all important to see, to understand where we're heading, the mood that it's there, the appetite is still there. And it's also, I think, up to us to really work together in trying to find the different approach, a renewed approach towards Africa, understanding better as well their needs, listening to what's happening, and making sure there is a greater alignment and greater collaboration. So I'll stop here and back to you, Mary. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.